Guten Abend, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Mein Name ist Christian Heimann und ich begrüße Sie sehr herzlich zu einer gemeinsamen Veranstaltung der ZEIT und der Buchhandlung Heimann. Und ich begrüße Sie zu einem Abend mit einem der wichtigsten und erfolgreichsten britischen Autoren. Ian McEwan wird sein neues Buch Kindeswohl, erschienen im wunderbaren Diogenes Verlag, vorstellen. Und bevor ich weitermache, ganz kurz Entschuldigung für das Kartenkuddelmuddel. Wir wissen nicht genau, wie es passiert ist. Wir hatten unterschiedliche Saalpläne. Bei uns waren Sitze drauf, die es hier gar nicht mehr gibt. Aber ich glaube, wir konnten das, oder hoffe, dass wir das zur Zufriedenheit aller lösen konnten, zumindest. Oder ist hier irgendjemand, der nicht, ich glaube, für alle war es von Vorteil, sie konnten vorne Platz nehmen, mein Platz ist auch weg. Aber ich wünsche Ihnen da viel Vergnügen. Ian McEwan, Jahrgang 48, hat einen Master of Arts in englischer Literatur und er hat einige Jahre an der University of Sussex unterrichtet. Seit dem Erfolg seiner Kurzgeschichtensammlung Erste Liebe, letzte Riten im Jahre 1975 lebt und arbeitet er als freier Schriftsteller. Mittlerweile sind über 17 Romane von ihm erschienen, allesamt äußerst erfolgreich. Sie werden nicht nur international verlegt, sondern einige wurden auch verfilmt. Für sein Werk wurde Ian McEwan vielfach ausgezeichnet. In Kindeswohl steht eine Richterin am englischen High Court vor der fast unlösbaren Frage, ob ein Minderjähriger und seine Eltern die dringend empfohlene medizinische Heilbehandlung verweigern dürfen. Und als ob das noch nicht genug wäre, bittet sie ihr Ehemann, mit dem sie eine seit über 30 Jahren vermeintlich glückliche Ehe führt, um die Erlaubnis zu einem Seitensprung, weil er seine sexuellen Wünsche noch einmal ausleben möchte. Wie die Idee zu diesem Roman entstanden ist und wie die Geschichte sich entwickelt, wird Ian McEwan gleich selber im Gespräch mit Daniel Haas erzählen. Daniel Haas ist Redakteur im Hamburg-Ressort von der ZEIT mit Schwerpunkt auf kulturelle und gesellschaftliche Themen. Er wird den heutigen Abend moderieren und das Gespräch mit Ian McEwan führen. Die ausgewählten deutschen Textpassagen, und darüber freuen wir uns sehr, werden von der Schauspielerin Katharina Schütz gelesen. Im Anschluss an die Veranstaltung, und da haben Sie wieder einen guten Platz, Sie sind schnell draußen, wird Ian McEwan gerne seine Bücher signieren. Das wird er hier im Foyer machen, direkt neben dem Büchertisch. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, im Namen der ZEIT und der Buchhandlung Heimann wünsche ich Ihnen einen kurzweiligen und interessanten Abend. Bitte begrüßen Sie zunächst Daniel Haas. Vielen Dank.
Ja, hallo. Hier ist eine tolle Perspektive von hier oben, ein ausverkauftes Haus. Die Karten waren ratzfatz weg und auch kein Wunder bei diesem Autor. Diese Floskel, man muss diesen Künstler und Schriftsteller nicht mehr vorstellen, die stimmt hier natürlich zu 100%. Deshalb will ich Sie jetzt auch nicht mit einer Tour d'horizon durch das Gesamtwerk von Ian McEwan aufhalten. Herr Heimann hat schon gesagt, das ist ein Autor, der Weltbestseller schreibt und das ist das Besondere für mich und auch seine große Leistung, der den kulturkritischen, den gesellschaftspolitischen und den literarästhetischen Diskurs, so hoch muss man das hängen, seit ungefähr 3 Dekaden, zumindest in der westlichen Welt, entscheidend mitgeprägt hat. Also diese Mischung aus Empathie und Fachwissen, die ist fast einmalig, würde ich sagen. Und Claudia Vogt hat in ihrem tollen Porträt im Spiegel von Ian McEwan geschrieben, seine Figuren nisten sich in unseren Köpfen ein und ich finde diesen Begriff ganz exakt gewählt. Das sind keine Plots und keine Geschichten oder Charaktere, wo wir sagen, oh, wow, was für ein krasser Typ oder irre Pointe, sondern das sind Figuren, die haben und Geschichten, die haben so eine Inkubationszeit und fächern ganz langsam ihr unheimliches, verstörendes, aber eben auch erkenntniskritisches und gewinnbringendes Potenzial auf. Heute Abend geht es um Kindeswohl. Das Buch heißt im Original The Children Act. Das bezeichnet das britische Kinder- und Jugendfürsorgegesetz von 1989. Auch darüber werden wir reden. Gleich wird Katharina Schütz für uns lesen, für Sie in den Text einsteigen. Katharina Schütz kennen Sie aus dem Film, aus Fernsehen, Theaterbühnen. Sie wird auch hier übrigens am 19. Februar nochmal lesen. Sie wird die sehr spitzen und bösen Musikkritiken, die Debussy geschrieben hat, wird sie hier zum Besten geben. Das ist ein Abend am 19. Februar. Sie wird auf Deutsch lesen und wir führen das Gespräch dann ausschließlich in Englisch. Das hat sich Ian McEwan so gewünscht. Das heißt, es wird keine deutsche Übersetzung geben. Ich werde das Gespräch mit so einem pseudo-kalifornischen Akzent bestreiten. das mache ja, das mache ich nicht, um Ian McEwan noch besser dastehen zu lassen, sondern ich kann es einfach nicht anders. Und wenn Sie denken, was macht denn dieser US Marshal da oben, das ist dann einfach so. Ja? Und damit geht es auch schon los. Und ich freue mich jetzt auf Katharina Schütz.
Kindeswohl von Ian McEwan, Deutsch von Werner Schmitz. London, Sonntagabend, eine Woche nach dem Ende der Gerichtsferien. Nasskaltes Juniwetter. Fiona May, Richterin am High Court, lag zu Hause auf der Chaiselongue und starrte über ihre bestrumpften Füße hinweg, quer durch den Raum. Ihr Blick streifte den Rand der Einbauregale, den Kamin und neben dem hohen Fenster die winzige Renoir-Lithografie einer Badenden, die sie vor 30 Jahren für 50 Pfund erworben hatte. Wahrscheinlich eine Fälschung. Darunter in der Mitte eines runden Walnusstisches eine blaue Vase. Keine Erinnerung, wie sie zu der gekommen war oder wann sie das letzte Mal Blumen darin hatte. Der Kamin seit einem Jahr nicht mehr angezündet. Auf dem Rost vergilbte Zeitungsknäuel, auf die sporadisch mit einem tickenden Geräusch rußgeschwärzte Regentropfen fielen. Ein Buchara-Läufer auf den breiten, gewachsenen Dielen. Am Rand des Blickfelds ein schwarz glänzender Stutzflügel, darauf Familienfotos in Silberrahmen. Auf dem Fußboden, neben der Chaiselongue, in Reichweite, der Entwurf eines Urteils. Und Fiona lag rücklings da und wünschte das alles auf den Meeresgrund. In ihrer Hand der zweite Scotch mit Wasser. Sie fühlte sich immer noch zittrig nach der schlimmen Szene mit ihrem Mann. Sie trank selten, aber der Talisker mit Leitungswasser war gerade Balsam für ihre Nerven und sie überlegte, ob sie zur Anrichte gehen und sich ein drittes Glas einschenken sollte. Weniger Scotch, mehr Wasser, denn morgen hatte sie Gerichtstermine. Und heute musste sie für dringende Fälle auf Abruf bereitstehen. Auch jetzt, wo sie sich auf der Chaiselongue von dem Gespräch erholte. Er hatte ihr mit seinem schockierenden Geständnis eine unzumutbare Bürde auferlegt. Zum ersten Mal seit Jahren hatte sie tatsächlich geschrien. Und ein schwaches Echo klang ihr noch immer in den Ohren. Du Idiot, du verdammter Idiot! Laut geflucht hatte sie seit ihren unbeschwerten Besuchen in Newcastle als Teenager nicht mehr, obwohl sich manchmal Kraftausdrücke in ihre Gedanken drängten, wenn sie sich eigennützige Falschaussagen oder juristische Haarspaltereien anhören musste. Ja, und gleich darauf hatte sie, keuchend vor Empörung, mindestens zweimal laut gesagt, wie kannst du es wagen? Das war schwerlich als Frage gedacht, aber er antwortete ruhig, ich brauche das. Ich bin 59. Das ist meine letzte Chance. Für ein Leben nach dem Tod fehlt meines Wissens bislang jeder Beweis. Eine prätentiöse Bemerkung, zu der ihr nichts eingefallen war. Sie starrte ihn nur an, womöglich mit offenem Mund. Erst jetzt auf der Chaiselongue, so spät, hatte sie eine Antwort. 59? Jack, du bist 60. Wie erbärmlich, wie banal. Tatsächlich hatte sie nur lahm erwidert, das ist doch einfach lächerlich. Fiona, wann haben wir das letzte Mal miteinander geschlafen? Ja. Wann? Er hatte sie das schon öfter gefragt, mal klagend, mal gereizt. Aber es kann schwerfallen, sich an die ereignisreiche jüngere Vergangenheit zu erinnern. Am Familiengericht wimmelte es von seltsamen Meinungsverschiedenheiten, Berufungen auf Sonderfälle, vertraulichen Halbwahrheiten und bizarren Anschuldigungen. Und wie auf allen juristischen Gebieten mussten feinkörnige Einzelheiten der Sachverhalte im Höchsttempo memoriert und verarbeitet werden. Vorige Woche hatte sie die Schlussplädoyers im Scheidungsverfahren jüdischer Eheleute gehört, die in ungleichem Maße orthodox darüber stritten, wie ihre Töchter erzogen werden sollten. Die Endfassung ihres Urteils lag neben ihr auf dem Boden. Morgen würde eine verzweifelte Engländerin erneut vor ihr erscheinen, hager, blass, gebildet, Mutter eines 5-jährigen Mädchens. Trotz dem Gericht vorliegender gegenteiliger Zusicherungen war sie überzeugt, dass der Vater, ein marokkanischer Geschäftsmann und strenggläubiger Muslim, plante, die gemeinsame Tochter der britischen Gerichtsbarkeit zu entziehen und nach Rabat zu verbringen, wo er ein neues Leben anfangen wollte. Dazu die üblichen Rangeleien um den Wohnort der Kinder, um Häuser, Renten, Einkünfte, Erbschaften. Es waren die größeren Vermögen, die vor dem High Court landeten. Reichtum garantierte nur selten anhaltendes Glück. Eltern wurden sehr bald mit dem neuen Vokabular und den geduldigen Mühlen der Justiz vertraut und fanden sich auf einmal zu ihrer Verblüffung in erbitterter Fehde mit dem Menschen wieder, den sie einmal geliebt hatten. Und hinter den Kulissen warteten Jungen und Mädchen, in den Gerichtsakten nur mit Vornamen geführt, Bens und Sarahs, die sich ängstlich aneinander klammerten, während die Götter über ihnen sich bis zur letzten Instanz zerfleischten, vom Familiengericht zum High Court bis zum Berufungsgericht, dem Court of Appeal. All diesem Leid war vieles gemeinsam, viel allgemein Menschliches, aber es faszinierte sie immer noch. Sie war überzeugt, dass sie Rationalität in aussichtslose Situationen hineinbringen konnte. Im Großen und Ganzen glaubte sie an die Bestimmungen des Familienrechts. In optimistischen Momenten hielt sie es für einen Meilenstein des zivilisatorischen Fortschritts, dass der Gesetzgeber die Bedürfnisse der Kinder über die der Eltern gestellt hatte. Ihre Tage waren ausgefüllt, in letzter Zeit auch die Abende, diverse Essenseinladungen, in Mitteltempel eine der 4 Anwaltskammern, ein Empfang für einen in Ruhestand gehenden Kollegen, ein Konzert in King's Place, Schubert, Scriabin, Taxifahrten, U-Bahn-Fahrten, Sachen von der Reinigung abholen, für den autistischen Sohn der Putzfrau einen Brief an eine Sonderschule aufsetzen und schlafen. Ja, wo war der Sex geblieben? Im Augenblick konnte sie sich nicht daran erinnern. Als ob ich Buch darüber führen würde. Er breitete die Hände aus. Keine weiteren Fragen. Sie hatte ihn beobachtet, als er durchs Zimmer ging und sich ein Scotch einschenkte. Einen Talisker, den sie jetzt auch trank. Er drehte ihr den Rücken zu. Und sie hatte ein kaltes Vorgefühl von Verstoßensein, von der Demütigung, für eine jüngere Frau verlassen zu werden, zurückgelassen zu werden, nutzlos und allein. Sie fragte sich, ob sie nicht einfach allem zustimmen sollte, was er verlangte, verwarf den Gedanken aber gleich wieder. Er war mit dem Glas zu ihr zurückgekommen. Er bot ihr keinen Sancerre an, wie sonst immer um diese Zeit. Was willst du, Jack? Ich werde diese Affäre haben. Du willst die Scheidung? Nein, ich will, dass alles bleibt, wie es ist, ohne dich zu hintergehen. Das verstehe ich nicht. Doch, das verstehst du. Hast du nicht selbst einmal gesagt, dass lang verheiratete Paare immer mehr wie Geschwister miteinander leben? An diesem Punkt sind wir jetzt, Fiona. Ich bin dein Bruder geworden. Das ist schön und behaglich und ich liebe dich. Aber bevor ich tot umfalle, will ich noch eine große, leidenschaftliche Affäre haben. Er missverstand ihr Schnauben als Lachen, als Spott vielleicht und sagte grob: Ekstase, vor Erregung fast ohnmächtig werden, erinnerst du dich? Ich will das noch ein letztes Mal, auch wenn du das nicht willst, oder vielleicht ja doch. Sie starrte ihn ungläubig an. Ja, da hast du's. Jetzt hatte sie endlich ihre Stimme wiedergefunden und ihm gesagt, was für ein Idiot er war. Sie war im Recht, da hatte sie nicht den geringsten Zweifel. Dass er ihr, soweit sie wusste, immer treu gewesen war, machte sein Ansinnen umso empörender. Oder falls er sie in der Vergangenheit betrogen hatte, dann offenbar äußerst geschickt. Den Namen der Frau kannte sie bereits. Melanie. Nicht unähnlich dem Namen einer tödlichen Form von Hautkrebs. Sie wusste, seine Affäre mit dieser 28-jährigen Statistikerin konnte ihr Ende bedeuten. Wenn du das tust, ist es aus mit uns. So einfach ist das. Ist das eine Drohung? Ein feierliches Versprechen. Inzwischen hatte sie sich wieder gefangen. Und es schien ja auch wirklich einfach. Der richtige Augenblick, um eine offene Ehe vorzuschlagen, war vor der Hochzeit, nicht 35 Jahre danach. Alles aufs Spiel zu setzen, nur damit er den flüchtigen Sinnenrausch noch einmal erleben konnte. Als sie sich so etwas für sich selbst vorzustellen versuchte, ihre letzte Affäre wäre ihre erste, dachte sie nur an Störungen, heimliche Verabredungen, Enttäuschungen und Anrufe zur Unzeit, das komplizierte Prozedere, bis man im Bett mit jemand Neuem zurechtkam, neu ersonnene Zärtlichkeiten, der ganze Schwindel. Und dann die Notwendigkeit, sich wieder zu lösen, die Anstrengung, offen und ehrlich zu sein. Und hinterher nichts mehr, wie es vorher war. Nein, sie zog ein unvollkommenes Dasein vor, dasjenige, das sie jetzt hatte. Aber auf der Chaiselongue stieg es vor ihr auf, das wahre Ausmaß der Kränkung. Dass er tatsächlich bereit war, für sein Vergnügen mit ihrem Elend zu bezahlen. Rücksichtslos. Sie hatte schon miterlebt, wie er seinen Willen auf Kosten anderer durchsetzte, meist im Dienst einer guten Sache. Das hier war neu. Was hatte sich verändert? Aufrecht hatte er dagestanden, breitbeinig, sich den Single Malt eingeschenkt und mit den Fingern der freien Hand einen Takt geschlagen, zu irgendeinem Song in seinem Kopf vielleicht, den er mit jemandem gehört hatte, aber nicht mit ihr. Ihr weh zu tun und sich nichts daraus zu machen, das war neu. Er war immer gütig gewesen, loyal und gütig. Und Güte, das zeigte sich tagtäglich im Familiengericht, war das entscheidende menschliche Merkmal. Fiona besaß die Macht, herzlosen Eltern ein Kind wegzunehmen, und manchmal tat sie es. Aber sich selbst vor einem herzlosen Gatten zu schützen, schwach und unglücklich wie sie war? Wo war der Richter, der ihr zu Hilfe kam? Selbstmitleid bei anderen machte sie verlegen, und für sie kam es schon gar nicht in Frage, dann lieber einen dritten Scotch. Doch sie nahm nur ein paar symbolische Tropfen mit viel Wasser und ging zur Chaiselongue zurück. Ja, das war eins dieser Gespräche gewesen, bei dem sie hätte Notizen machen sollen, um sich genau zu erinnern, um die Kränkung sorgfältig auszuloten. Auf ihre Drohung, die Ehe zu beenden, falls er mit seiner Affäre ernst mache, war ihm nichts Besseres eingefallen, als sich zu wiederholen, nochmals zu beteuern, dass er sie liebe, immer lieben werde, dass es für ihn nur dieses Leben gebe, dass seine unerfüllten sexuellen Bedürfnisse ihn todunglücklich machten, dass er jetzt diese eine Gelegenheit habe und sie mit ihrem Wissen und, so hoffe er, mit ihrer Zustimmung nutzen wolle. Er rede im Geiste Aufrichtigkeit mit ihr. Er hätte es auch hinter ihrem Rücken tun können. Ihrem schmalen, unversöhnlichen Rücken. Oh, flüsterte sie. Wie anständig von dir, Jack. Na ja, also eigentlich, sagte er und verstummte. Sie nahm an, jetzt käme das Geständnis, dass ihre Affäre längst begonnen hatte, und das wollte sie nicht hören. Das hatte sie nicht nötig. Sie sah es ja. Da arbeitete eine hübsche Statistikerin an der Verringerung der Wahrscheinlichkeit, dass ein Mann zu seiner verbitteten Frau zurückkehrte. Sie sah einen sonnigen Morgen, ein fremdes Bad, darin Jack mit seiner noch recht sportlichen Figur, wie er sich auf seine ungeduldige Art ein halb aufgeknöpftes, frisches, weißes Leinenhemd über den Kopf zog, ein anderes Hemd achtlos Richtung Wäschekorb geworfen, hing noch an einem Ärmel an der Kante, ehe es auf den Fußboden fiel. Der Untergang. Es würde passieren. Mit oder ohne ihre Zustimmung. Die Antwort lautet Nein. Sie hatte die Stimme erhoben, wie eine gestrenge Schulmeisterin. Hast du denn was anderes erwartet? Sie fühlte sich hilflos und sie wollte nicht mehr weiterreden. Bis morgen musste sie ein Urteil für die Veröffentlichung im Familiengerichtsbulletin überarbeiten. Das weitere Schicksal zweier jüdischer Schulmädchen war mit der Entscheidung, die sie im Gericht verkündet hatte, bereits besiegelt. Aber der Text musste noch geglättet und daraufhin durchgesehen werden, dass er ja keine religiösen Gefühle verletzte und somit Berufungsgründe bot. Draußen schlug Sommerregen an die Fenster. Weiter weg, jenseits von Gray's Inn Square, zischten Reifen über nassen Asphalt. Er würde sie verlassen und die Welt würde sich weiterdrehen. Mit angespannter Miene zuckte er die Schultern, wandte sich ab und ging aus dem Zimmer. Beim Anblick seines Rückens überkam sie wieder diese kalte Angst. Am liebsten hätte sie ihm nachgerufen. Doch die Furcht, ignoriert zu werden, hielt sie zurück. Und was hätte sie auch sagen sollen? Halt mich fest, küss mich, nimm das Mädchen. Sie hörte seine Schritte im Flur, ihre Schlafzimmertür ins Schloss fallen, dann nur noch Stille in der Wohnung. Stille. Und Regen, der seit einem Monat nicht aufhören wollte. Jetzt überspringe ich ein paar Seiten und lese weiter auf Seite 40. Lass ihn ziehen, sagt eine Stimme, ihre eigene Stimme in ihrem Kopf. Und sofort packte sie wieder die alte Angst. Sie wollte den Rest ihres Lebens nicht allein bewältigen. Zwei gute Freundinnen, so alt wie sie, seit langem geschieden, hassten es immer noch wie die Pest, ohne Begleitung einen Raum voller Leute zu betreten. Und über den gesellschaftlichen Nimbus hinaus war da noch die Liebe, die sie für ihn empfand. Nur jetzt gerade nicht. Dein Problem ist, sagte er vom anderen Ende des Zimmers, dein Problem ist, dass du nie glaubst, dich erklären zu müssen. Du hast dich von mir entfernt. Dir muss doch aufgefallen sein, dass ich das spüre und dass es mir was ausmacht. Wenn ich wüsste, dass es nicht ewig dabei bleibt oder was dahinter steckt, könnte ich vielleicht damit leben und deshalb. Er machte einen Schritt auf sie zu, aber weder erfuhr sie seine Schlussfolgerung, noch konnte sie ihrer zunehmenden Gereiztheit Luft machen, denn in diesem Augenblick klingelte das Telefon. Und automatisch nahm sie den Hörer ab. Ja, sie hatte Bereitschaftsdienst und natürlich war es ihr juristischer Sekretär Nigel Pauling. Wie immer mit zögernder Stimme, kurz vorm Stottern, aber ein tüchtiger, angenehm zurückhaltender Mensch. Entschuldigen Sie die späte Störung, Milady. Schon gut, was gibt's? Der Anwalt der Edith Cavell Klinik in Wandsworth hat angerufen. Es geht um eine dringende Bluttransfusion für einen Krebspatienten, einen 17-jährigen Jungen. Er und seine Eltern verweigern die Zustimmung. Die Klinik möchte... Warum verweigern Sie die Zustimmung? Zeugen Jehovas, Milady. Aha. Die Klinik möchte sich gerichtlich absichern, dass sie gegen den Willen der Eltern Transfusionen vornehmen darf. Sie sah auf die Uhr. Kurz nach 10:30. Wie viel Zeit haben wir? Nach Mittwoch wird es gefährlich, sagen Sie. Äußerst gefährlich. Sie blickte auf. Jack war bereits aus dem Zimmer gegangen. Dann setzen Sie für Dienstag 14 Uhr einen Eiltermin an und benachrichtigen die Gegenseite. Weisen Sie die Klinik an, die Eltern zu informieren, damit sie Gegenantrag stellen können. Lassen Sie für den Prozess einen Vormund für den Jungen bestimmen. Die Klinik soll bis morgen 16 Uhr ihre Argumente einreichen und ein Gutachten des behandelnden Onkologen. Sie verlor kurz den Faden, räusperte sich und fuhr fort. Ich möchte wissen, warum Blutprodukte notwendig sind. Und die Eltern sollen sich bemühen, bis Dienstagmittag ihre Argumente vorzulegen. Wird alles sofort erledigt. Sie ging ans Fenster und sah auf den Platz hinaus, wo die Bäume im letzten Licht der langen Junidämmerung zu schwarzen Konturen wurden. Bis jetzt beleuchteten die gelben Straßenlaternen nicht mehr als ein Kreis auf dem Pflaster. Der Sonntagabendverkehr hatte sich gelichtet. Kaum ein Geräusch drang von der Grays Inn Road oder der High Holborn zu ihr her. Nur das Pochen vereinzelter Regentropfen auf Laub und das melodische Gurgeln eines nahen Abflussrohrs. Sie beobachtete eine Nachbarskatze, die da unten zimperlich um eine Pfütze herumschlich und sich im Dunkel eines Strauchs verlor. Jacks Rückzug machte ihr keine Sorgen. Ihr Gespräch hatte auf eine schmerzhafte Offenheit zugesteuert. Es ließ sich nicht leugnen. Sie war erleichtert, sich plötzlich auf neutralem Boden in der kahlen Steppe der Probleme anderer Leute wiederzufinden. Schon wieder Religion, die auch Tröstungen bereithielt.
Welcome, Ian McEwan. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you here. And you started writing immediately back there. What did you write? You picked out a little booklet and started writing. It's very indiscreet, I know.
Well, would it disappoint you if I said it was just a laundry list? But but no, I am actually writing the screenplay of this novel. So I was thinking how, I've already written a third of it, but I was thinking we arrive too late in a movie. It's okay in a novel, but too late in a movie to get to this boy who's in hospital refusing a blood transcription. So I was thinking, how would we get a camera? And I imagined a young porter, the same age as that boy, pushing a trolley through all kinds of dramas, hospital dramas of the kind you see on TV, but he's not interested, just listening to his headphones. But the thing that does interest him is this boy his own age who's prepared to die.
Who he is, because he's 17?
Yeah, and that's when I thought, yeah, when their eyes meet, then you can go into the rest of the story. Then you cut away. So that's what I was doing.
Who's going to play Meryl Streep, I guess?
I'm not allowed to say, in case we have to go to. No, I'm not allowed to say. But can I just, before we begin, Daniel, enter an apology? I'm so sorry. I do speak a little Schuldeutsch, but I would hate to inflict on you the torment, the murder I would commit on the language of Goethe and Heine and Thomas Mann. So I hope you'll tolerate this English. Second best.
Speaking of the boy, I think that went really quick. Mr. Heimann, he summed up the plot of the story of the book. So could we just probably, to give the audience a feeling what the story is about? There's this boy. He's 17 years old.
Yes, running in parallel with the domestic drama that you've heard this evening is the sort of case that comes before courts quite frequently, right across the world, I discovered in my research. It's a fundamental right in most legal systems that you cannot treat a patient against his or her will. So it's an awkward matter when someone is refusing a blood transfusion that might save their lives. And often the hospital will go to a court to overrule, asking the court to give them permission to overrule the patient's wishes. And Jehovah's Witnesses have forbid themselves to have blood transfusions, or mostly. There are some who will accept certain blood products, but on the whole, drawing from Leviticus and Genesis and Acts, a few, I mean, I think they were simply just dietary restrictions, but they have somehow elevated these into a very strong commandment. So every now and then a child or a teenager is refusing blood, and the courts intervene, and overwhelmingly the courts will give the hospital permission on the assumption that let that child become 18 and then they can make a more mature decision. That's really the basis of this drama.
But then the tricky thing in this book is that this boy, he's not 10, he's not 12, he's 17 years old. He's at the verge of becoming 18, and he's well read, he's very bright and talented and intelligent. So it's really tricky for that Fiona May, the judge.
It's what in English law is called an anxious matter.
An anxious matter.
A rather wonderful phrase. But still, 18 is the law, even though in most other cases, in the English and Welsh jurisdiction, wherever there's an age limit, there's always an allowance, a bit of discretion on either side. But here the courts will not allow a discretion. And it does occasionally happen, and I don't mind giving away the plot of this novel, that a child is saved, but with the blood transfusion goes away, comes back a few years later, needs that blood again, refuses it, and then dies. But
you're giving away the plot of the novel.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Why'd you do? Why'd you do that? That was a great moment for me reading this book. I mean,
memories are short.
Well,
in a week's time, you won't even remember where you were last week.
So the judge as main character of a novel, that is rather unusual. Why did you choose this time a judge to be your protagonist?
Well, it's odd. The law, I mean, fiction has, a big chunk of sub-genre of fiction has lived off the law. And we know about criminals, and we know about their victims, and we know about cops and private eyes, and attorneys and barristers and advocates. But we know little about judges. I mean, maybe it's different within the German tradition, but we don't have many judges in our crime fiction. There are some notable exceptions. There's Judge Dredd, God himself, of course. Not a great one for due process. But on the whole, it's unreflected in the literature. And yet they're key. I know from personal experience of people close to me going before a judge, knowing full well that the outcome might have been completely different if you'd gone before a different judge. Mm-hmm. So they're interpreting the same law, but the personality of the judge can be crucial. Many English judges, and of course we have an adversarial system, you have an investigating system, but many English judges affect a kind of constant, weary irritability, which puts everyone on their guard. But not all judges do this. And one judge who's has become a friend over the last 15 years or so is known for his wit and charm in court. And getting to know him and getting to know some of his friends, also judges, and once being at dinner with several judges all around the dinner table, I became fascinated by their conversation. They knew each other's judgments. They teased each other about their judgments. They even quoted a line or two. And the judges they were most critical of were the judges who were foolish enough to be absent. And I thought, this could be a bunch of novelists sitting around. And then I started reading judgments, and I thought, this is a neglected corner of our literature. Here you have dramas, you have characters, you have plots, you have strange outcomes, sometimes violent. But the family law was what began to interest me more than anything else. Again, rather neglected in the literature. The literature lives off crime. Family law is a whole different world, but it's so much closer to the concerns of fiction. Love and the end of love, which is, the divorce courts are full of love and the end of love. Well, what is literature if it's not so frequently love and the end of love? And then issues around dying and disease and what people intended in their wills and the struggle over the futures of children and so on. Very much in the territory of fiction. So I was just waiting really for a subject for a number of years, and then the Jehovah's Witness case came up. Same judge, judged in the early 90s. And I read his judgment on it and thought, although I want to change lots of things, it's in this territory that I wanted to go.
You said in an interview, and I quote, "A judgment is like a story, self-justifying, intact, almost like a delusion, a psychotic delusion. It's perfectly intact." That's a rather strong picture for...
I don't remember saying that about a judgment, but
you did,
if you say so. Okay.
Really?
It sounds more like my description of religion. Anyway.
We'll get to that.
But religion is a mild psychosis, rather than... Anyway, they're certainly intact. No, on the whole, I was rather in the good judgments. Anyway, when you read a good judgment and you realize that these things are written often at high speed, or sometimes they're not even written at all, they're delivered verbally and written up afterwards. They show, many judges like to show off their knowledge of philosophy and their history of thought, and they throw in some little bits of Aristotle, something from Plato. When you have to decide, for example, what is in a child's best interests, many judges will then define for you what they think interests are. What is a good life? Then you're very near a philosophical pursuit. So no, I can't help feeling you're mistaken, but let's not dwell on that. On the whole, my sense of the best judgments I read were certainly intact, but not psychotic.
You seem to be fascinated by the great institutionalized authorities in general. Saturday, in the novel, you have the protagonist belongs to the medical profession, and Solar is a research scientist, and Sweet Tooth an agent for MI5. Yeah. So it's about the workings of institutionalized power. Will there be a book about politics one day, or probably finance, or even journalists?
I wrote about journalists in a novel called Amsterdam. So I've done that. Yes, I'd quite like to do politics. How to immerse myself. Of course, because we have the government we have now, I don't have any friends in. But that could change. We have 100 days to our next election. So.
You had quite an interesting encounter with Tony Blair at the Tate Gallery once, I read.
Yes, I'm not sure he's forgiven me, or me him, actually. We were at the opening of the Tate Modern, and my wife and I and a friend we got away from all the champagne drinking. We thought we'd actually go and look at some paintings. And we went to look in the Rothko room. And then we went next door, and there was Tony Blair and the director of the gallery, Nick Sirota, and a big cluster of flunkies and PR people, but also journalists, and behind a velvet rope. And Nicholas Sirota knows my wife, Annalene, and he waved at us three, and then to our horror, he brought Tony Blair towards us. Dragging in his train 50 journalists and the Prime Minister's retinue. And we were introduced, and Prime Minister Blair shook my hand and said, I'm a great admirer of your work. And I said, thank you very much, Prime Minister. And he said, yes, we have 2 of your paintings in... And it was one of those situations, you know, when you shake a hand with a politician, they don't let go of your hand. They push it up and down. So I said, no, no, and he said, yes, yes, yes. And then one of his aides said, Tony, we have to be out of the building in 35 seconds. And so the whole of the Prime Minister's retinue swept out of the room, leaving me with the journalists. And naturally they said, what did the Prime Minister say? And I said, I already thought, I'm going to have this story, not you. So I said, the Prime Minister said he admires my work. And I left it at that.
So this is how you became a painter, actually.
We were discussing, I mean, before we, when we were sitting in the green room upstairs, but were already wearing these wonderful mics, wondering whether they were switched on. And I was telling Daniel that when Gordon Brown was fighting to remain Prime Minister, he was on the stomp going around various towns, and he'd been giving a speech, and he was wearing some sort of microphone, and a woman accosted him and said, your government is not doing enough about immigration, we're being overrun with this, it's absolutely terrible. And he was on the back foot with this and gave an awkward reply. But when he got back onto his bus, he tore into one of his aides, who let that bloody woman near me. And it was broadcast to all the journalists. And Gordon Brown then had to go to the woman's house, be photographed having tea with her, apologizing. And then this woman gave a press conference and asked if she had forgiven Gordon Brown, said no. And it was a major part in the failure of his election. So that is bound to be of interest I think. How a small slip like that could just change not only your fate, but the fate of your country.
This could be a topic for you. This could be a topic for...
Yeah. So, yes, to answer your question, it's a long way of saying yes. I mean, I think politics is... because it's so much about appearances, and when they crack, what extraordinary things can follow.
There are wonderful depictions of work life in the book. Fiona's judicial colleagues, they, I quote, lose themselves daily in their cases. At lunchtime there is banter and irony, and Gray's Inn, where they work, is a, I quote, nest of gossip and expertise. I was really envious. It's a great milieu that you depicted there. And gossip and expertise, where are you getting that?
Well, journalism is just the same, isn't it? Well, I don't know about the expertise, but gossip. All work communities have this fascination, I think. And I don't know why it is. The novel has... Well, there's certainly... Going back, let's go back 80 years, I think the modernist novel rather neglected work. And yet it's a defining element in people's lives. It often defines also not who they think they are and their self-esteem or their lack of it, but who they marry and so on. It creates its own languages, its own codes of behavior. So for that, I think it's interesting in itself. In the world of in London, there are 4 Inns of Court: Inner and Middle, Temple, Gray's Inn, and Lincoln's Inn, and they're like old Oxford or Cambridge colleges. So you've got all of London surging around them, and you step down through a little gate, and you're in this quiet world with quadrangles and perfectly mowed lawns and ancient rooms, and people still wearing 18th century wigs, and yet, when you meet them socially, first of all, you find that the judges have a very wicked sense of humour. And I think it's partly to do with responsibility. Because you have this ability, power, to rob citizens of their freedom, you're almost hysterical with laughter. They have a lot of quite cynical jokes about each other and about what's going on. So that world of work is of great fascination to me.
But you're not at all cynical about the case of Adam, this boy, and although it's very obvious that you're unsympathetic to Jehovah's Witnesses' viewpoint in that case, yet you offer both sides of the story. You had to. There's a...
I have the boy's father comes to court and makes the case. And it seemed to me that if you're going to do this properly, you really need to do it from their side and to give the best possible account of what they would regard to be the preciousness of life. And remember too that small religious sects offer a great deal of sort of loving support. I mean, they can be very controlling, very exclusive, and so on. But the positive side, I would guess, would be that sense of strong community, a real sense of purpose for everybody within it, a real sense of identity, in other words. And so I tried to give the father all the best lines I could, and almost to the point that he outdoes the barrister who is cross-examining him. That seemed the least I could do, because it actually, by any human measure, it's indefensible to let a child be martyred for your own thought system. I mean, I don't think anyone could really mount a great defense for it.
And courts wouldn't allow it, actually. They wouldn't, right?
Sorry?
Courts wouldn't allow it, actually.
No, I only found one case where the judge happened to be a Jehovah's Witness himself in the southern United States. And a child did die. Very conveniently, while I was writing this novel, Jehovah's Witnesses came to my door, as they do.
Good you're here.
Yeah.
Come in.
And of course, with their usual questions, would they be interested in letting Jesus into your life and so on. And I, on the last occasion, two came and I had quite a long conversation. I'd already finished my novel by then, but it was still in proof, and I thought I could, anything could change. And I was quite open. I said, listen, I've just written a novel about the whole blood transfusion business. Tell me, both of you, as a man and a woman, would you let a child die rather than have a blood transfusion, your own child? And they both said, absolutely yes. And then they said, but the reason we would do that is we think differently about death. You think that death is the end, but we think it's just a transition. And they gave a very, from within their own thought system, a very plausible sense that if the child dies, sacrifices its life, not taking the blood, in this case, this is a form of leukemia that Adam has, then that child is extremely special in the eyes of God, and in the paradise on earth that will follow, that child will be full of grace. So the thing is completely intact in that way. But to an outsider, it would be, I think, a tragedy. Would you let a 9-year-old child die for want of half a litre of blood?
So we are already addressing a very hot potato, that is religion versus reason somehow.
Well, it's an interesting potato.
It's a very interesting potato.
I don't think it's so hot. We can handle it.
And the reason versus profound religion, it crops up in Enduring Love and in Black Dogs, but never so starkly as in The Children Act, which is the original title of the book. So for quite some time, it seemed it seemed to be common sense that nationalism and religion would be gone somehow.
Yes.
And now we have these domestic cases you're referring to, and on a global stage we have ISIS and the battles in the name of holy war. Are you yourself surprised by the persistence of religion?
I am surprised, actually. I mean, if you told me in 1980 that we'd be talking so much, so constantly, thinking, worrying, wondering about certain extreme versions of religion, then yes, I think it is a surprise. I mean, in my life, the modern conversation about religion began with the Rushdie affair. I was very closely involved with Salman in all that. And that was really the first time that I thought how extraordinary that we are dealing with religion again. And the whole complex matter of how free, open, plural societies deal with free speech. And it's not a simple matter, clearly. It's never an absolute. There are plenty of people we want to deny free speech to, like pedophiles or whatever on the internet. And yet at the same time, for many of us in secular countries where most people don't go to church, we somehow have to manage the fact that in a big city like Hamburg or Berlin, Paris, London, New York, you may have up to 10 million people living on a space of land the size of a medium American cattle ranch, with really divergent views, cheek by jowl. And daily, let's leave the atheists out of this for the moment, but daily Christians blaspheme in the face of Islam, I mean, and vice versa. Is Mohammed God's last messenger? Not according to Christians. Is Jesus the Son of God? Certainly not according to Islam. And then to expand that outwards, is the universe, the cosmos, best explained without reference to God, but with reference to modern physics? Not in the eyes of Christians or Muslims. So who's going to guarantee the peace? Well, not religion. Only the secular state can guarantee that all religions are free to pursue their worship. And I think that's the conundrum, because the secular state also wants to speak freely about everything. And so we can run into some terrible problems, as we did 3 weeks ago in Paris.
So you said also in an interview, we're not entirely free to discuss about Islam anymore.
I think it's true what someone said in London at a public debate when various British newspapers were wondering whether they should reproduce the Charlie Hebdo covers, that if you're not going to do it, you should have the guts to say that you feel threatened. Because the worst kind of censorship is the one where everyone is silent about their reasons for doing so. And so it's much better to say, well, the reason we're not running these cartoons is we're worried about the safety of our staff, for example. And of course, here in Germany, you had a case of a firebombing almost straight away, didn't you? My friend Tim Garton-Ash has proposed that there is a sort of a depository, a kind of dump on the internet for all images that might offend someone or other. And any newspaper can say, if you want to look at this image, click onto and then give the web address. So only if you want to be offended do you go on this site. Well, I wasn't persuaded by this argument. Partly, just to go back to Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, nobody needed to read that book. In fact, most people in the streets who were protesting about it had not read this book. So it's really the idea, I mean, most moral positions have an element of universalism about it. It's not whether you can click onto it or not, it's whether it exists, and you protest against that. But it's very, very difficult. I mean, we are now in... we really need to keep having a discussion about what free speech is.
In summer 2014, you said in an interview that, and I quote, that we experienced the darkest news cycle within ages, and you felt like a rabbit in the headlights. Speaking of Eastern Ukraine, Ebola, Iraq, Syria, all the extreme atrocities around the world. And it reminded me of Don DeLillo speaking up after 9/11, where practically all the writers seemed to be also like feeling like rabbits in the headlights. Is the author still equipped today to deal with these kind of developments?
I think they're equipped, but rather poorly. I mean, I'm talking here of novelists, because I think that novelists need to be slow. Novelists need to cook things slowly. What 9/11 needed, or what Iraq, Syria, ISIS needs, what Eastern Ukraine needs is reportage, the best reportage, the long form of reportage, the 8,000-word piece, not by some blogger who's never left his room except to go to the lavatory, but someone who's gone there, taken the risks, learned a bit of the language. In other words, journalists. I mean, I think we do need to rely on the old-fashioned expertise of foreign correspondence in this rapidly changing situations that we have. But we need people with expertise. I mean, we really do need people who can take the risks. And it's been interesting that actually in the wars, for example, the Arab Spring and then the collapse of the Arab Spring and all its disappointed hopes, and the way that huge populations across the Middle East now found themselves trapped between either state tyranny or religious tyranny, and sometimes overlapping, but often themselves in conflict. And that democratic impulse, that impulse of hope for to let in a little more air, has been dashed. And by far the best way of knowing about that was not from the blogosphere, but from old-fashioned correspondence.
And you read a lot of newspapers. You became a news junkie, you said.
Well, I have been for a while. Yeah.
I know you don't like the word, but I will still have to use it, in lack of a better word. That's the A word. You're an atheist, right? It sounds rather negative, right?
Yeah, I mean, what about all these dead religions? With Thor and Jupiter, or Father Christmas, or do you have a tooth fairy here?
Not exactly, but we know what it is. We've got
Okay.
Zahnfee.
Well, I'm a tooth fairyist, and I suspect most people are here. So we on our side do not refer to Baptist ministers in the Deep South as Darwinists, nor would they like to think of themselves in that. And nor do we think of ourselves as a movement, nor do we give any space to that ridiculous canard that atheism is just another kind of faith. I like to quote the story of Bertrand Russell, the great English mathematician and philosopher, he was a very eloquent atheist. And the story went that when he died, he found to his astonishment that he was at the gates of heaven, talking not to Peter, but to God himself. And God says to Bertrand Russell, "Why didn't you believe in me?" And Bertrand Russell said, "Well, old man, not enough proof." "Why didn't you send down some proof?" And I guess that's my problem. I think all of our science would have to change if the sky were to open up and 3,000 independent observers, not just one, but 3,000 at least, were to see God in all his glory demonstrating the fact that he existed. Or if Catholics would allow us to examine blood at the moment of transubstantiation and we'd see the DNA of Christ. There's nothing wrong with asking for proof because the claims of religion are so extraordinary. They are so extravagantly extraordinary that they require extraordinary proof.
Since Richard Dawkins asked you that, I feel entitled to ask you too. Have you always been an atheist? Or did you have a religion at one time in your life?
I had a vague kind of mystical sense when I was 10 or 11 that at night when I fell asleep I had to run through every member of my close family and ask God to keep him or her alive. And it was a bit like that sort of paving crack, don't tread on it sort of thing. And often I would fall asleep in the middle of this because the list was quite long. It was a way of counting sheep. But like most children who are not under heavy bombardment of religious influence, sooner or later, in your early teens or if not before, you start asking yourself, why is this terrible? Why has this child died in a car accident? Why is this good person suffering? Why is that bad person's going scot-free? And sooner or later, it begins to dawn on you that the world is configured exactly as if there was no God. I mean, this is just how it would be if there wasn't a God. So if there is one, he either has a horrible sense of humor, or he's impotent in helping us solve our problems. He's prepared to see children die of cancer for some greater purpose that we can never understand. So I accept that it's a great consolation to people. I accept too that great art has flown from profound religious conviction. It's been the cause of the most extraordinary buildings, cathedrals, and so on, and mosques. But at the same time, it's also been behind some of the most bloody and vicious wars. The 30-Year War, I think, is unequaled. And this was just a war of tiny differences. The difference between Protestantism and Catholicism is actually thinner than a Rizzler paper. Yeah. In the larger scheme of things. In the larger scheme of things, given all the available infinite space of possible philosophies, these are very close together. So, yes, but I like to think of my children, who are now around about 30 years old. I might be an atheist, but they're not even an atheist. Whereas I and my generation had to deny God, it doesn't occur to them to deny God.
What are they doing?
They're not even atheists. They're off the map.
They're spiritual, probably. You don't like that word either, don't you?
No, they're not spiritual.
But speaking of...
But look, can I just finish? I mean, look at all the transcendent pleasures you can have from love, friendship, literature, painting, and landscape. All these things can give you a sense of something larger than yourself, of profound significance. I don't think we need to reach then for the supernatural, for those things.
We don't.
Or even for the word spiritual, which again,
I know you don't like it.
No. If I'd had a gun, I'd reach for it. But,
Speaking of guns and you reaching for guns, it's interesting. The University of Texas Austin acquired your archive, including drafts of manuscripts as well as email and personal correspondence. And among the papers are letters you wrote 30 years ago to your 3-year-old son, Gregory. And I quote, "Yesterday, a bad person took my bag." You wrote to 3-year-old Gregory. "So today, I'm going to the police station to help the policeman catch the thief." Yours, Daddy. So there was a time when you believed in taking the law in your own hands, I guess.
No, I was going to the police. Excuse me.
Coming back to
that was terrible, actually, because in that bag was all my notes of whatever I was writing, and an Australian, New Zealand radio station, which was broadcast very early in the morning, took an interest in my bag. I lost it in an area of New Zealand called Coromandel. And the Coromandel Times had on the front page, big headline said, "Author loses bag." And every day I get a phone call when I was fast asleep, sort of 6:45 in the morning, saying, "Have they got your bag yet?" Live on radio. And then in the end my bag was found.
It was found?
Yeah. Empty.
Well, reading your book, and you already mentioned, I remember this quote from Matthew 7, "Judge not that you be not judged." So the Bible is a compilation of court cases and judgments and trials. So
without due process.
So from our earliest works of literature, if we can call the Bible also a piece of prose, there seems to be this tension between metaphysics and rationality.
Well, the Bible is full of judgments. And one has to say that one of the extraordinary things about the Old Testament in contrast to the New is that whereas the Old often seems to sanction slavery, genocide, rape, murder of your enemies, at least, with the aid of God, the New Testament does burst into some extraordinary degree of light. It's a religion, at least in theory, built around the notion of love, in which forgiveness is central. So even someone without belief would have to note that the New Testament and the dawn of Christianity was an extraordinary leap forward in compassion and in moral compassion. No question about that. What actually happened? I mean, Council of Nicaea, already schisms on an amazing scale, much pain and intolerance. But at least the kernel of an idea in which rationality could be tied to compassion, which is what I think I want to give Fiona doing. That rationality is not a cold, bloodless thing. It's a warm, intelligent, human thing. We often demand it of each other, even in the most difficult moments in our lives. And the law at its best would be the codification of all that. But of course, human institutions have complex histories, and things are never quite, what their intentions are, and laws become irrational, become written over by other instances, become full of sometimes the vested interests of others, and so on. So, yes, somewhere in the Bible, and it's absolutely true in the Hadith of the Quran, is a strong sense that societies need to be governed by laws. It's a very powerful...
And not a higher... Not a higher being. And you would say we are instinctively moral. That is, in that talk with Dawkins, you said we are instinctively moral.
I think he's absolutely right. We look at our nearest evolutionary neighbors, bonobos and chimps, and in troops we see people doing each other's favors, remembering, making alliances, having a strong sense of what's fair and what's not fair. Often this justice is very rough, but I think even creatures with less prefrontal cortex than our own are operating a very powerful sense of morality, and it would make sense for any social creature. You look at what we call the social emotions, gratitude, when you remember a favor, when you feel an emotional response to some good that's done to you, or anger, a negative emotion by which you wish to limit or put confines around the behavior of others. All of these must grow out of us trying to get along together. And actually, we don't congratulate ourselves enough on this. If you live in London, 10 million people on a cattle ranch, it's amazing how few people do get murdered. I mean, in London last year, 28 people got murdered. And all those people squashed onto the tube train, going this way and that way. I mean, we have managed, we can't be too hard on ourselves, with that range of instinctual moral behavior. We control our own impulses. Think of guilt. A massive self-controlling impulse that we have. No one teaches us how to feel guilty. The whole range of social emotions hold us to certain kinds of implicit moral acts. And I think one of the great false claims of religion, especially in the 19th century, when the atheists were beginning to become more prominent in public life, society will disintegrate without religion because there'll be no morals. But in fact, we now know today that recently published survey, the 10 least violent countries in the world are also the 10 least religious. And I think Norway was at the top. So I think we can detach morality from religion.
Let's see if we can detach art from religion. Of course we can. You said we don't need a god to celebrate Mozart.
No.
But interestingly, the way you describe the aesthetic experience of music in the book, that's very tender and it's very sweet and moving. And all these judges you describe, Fiona and her colleagues, and they're very cultured, especially when it comes to music, jazz and classical music.
The concert halls of London are packed full of judges. You can't get a seat sometimes. The judges.
And the very delicate and tender way you depict, there's a concert scene in the book, and then there's this very moving scene when Fiona goes to Adam in the hospital, and they play together, they make classical music. And you will hate me for this. Does music have a somewhat, I can't say it,
spiritual aspect?
You said it.
Well, I think it's like love and landscape and all those other wonderful things that I touched on, that it brings on in us, at its best, a feeling of release and joy and a sense of enlarged mental space and pleasure in being alive and all that. But I think all these things are happening in the brain, not in the sky. So, which brings us back to, I think, one of the great wonders and mysteries of life, which we might never fully explain, which is how matter, organized in a certain way, can generate consciousness. Can generate consciousness that can adore the music of Mozart. So, my friend Christopher Hitchens, who was not a God-loving man himself, he had a strong sense that he would rather seek wisdom in the entirety of the world's literatures than in any single religious book. Mm-hmm. So from Tolstoy to George Eliot to Shakespeare to Goethe to Racine, you will find not so much someone telling you how to live, but an investigation of every moral dilemma that you could possibly conceive of. And out of that, we could take what we want. But again, it doesn't need anything more than what we've got.
We've been talking about this before the reading. One of my favorite texts of you've written is an essay from The Guardian. It's called "When Faith in Fiction Falters and How It Is Restored." It was published in The Guardian in 2013. And es gibt auch eine Übersetzung. There's a translation called The Long Night. The German title is The Long Night of the Author. Die lange Nacht des Schriftstellers. The Neue Zürcher Zeitung, is a very prestigious old paper from Switzerland, has published the essay. It's wonderful. And interestingly, I don't know if it's a satire, but it uses religious vocabulary in an excessive way.
Yeah.
And the text, you have to read it. I think, as I told you, I think every scholar of literature and everyone who wants to write should read this text, because it's a very, very sweet and moving, very brilliant depiction of the process you, as an author, undergo when you're writing and having written. And then you say there's this phase when you're really bored with novels, and you say, oh my God, not another... What will I have, I quote, what will I have or know at the end of yet another novel beyond Henry's remorse or triumph, Henry being the everyman. And then you say, will a novelist please tell me why the Industrial Revolution began, or how morality evolved, or what Salieri thought of the young Schubert in his choir? I mean, that is a really heavy burden for...
Yeah. Did you know that Schubert sang in Salieri's choir? I bet you would never learn it from a novel. But yes, I think it's something of a mild panic. As you get older, you want to know as much, you want to be told about the world, specifically, so that history, science, non-fiction becomes very important. And I notice from my generation of novelists, I said, what have you been reading lately? They often don't say novels. They say, I'm reading a book on cosmology or a biography of, or a history of the Napoleonic Wars or whatever. And I think that if you spend your life writing novels, every now and then you grow exhausted with the whole business and you just want to become a pupil again in the face of, and it's fantastic, you go in a bookshop and go into the non-fiction section. What an amazing expertise is sitting there, or in a library, for your delight. But that essay is also about, and I think I even use the word redemption. It's full of religious language. That sooner or later something will turn. And often it's just finding a wonderful phrase, a little moment of felicity in a novel or a story that you happen to pick up. And suddenly, again, that mental space, big wide open space, backs up that old feeling of ambition, that taste to be up for the game again. But it takes a while, I think. And I think as you get older, it takes a little longer.
And this is why you describe all these stages and phases of the creative process, and in the end there's this kind of hymn about the literary process. And you write that sometimes when you get back into the game of writing and the literary realism, then you say, the atheist may lie down with the believer, the encyclopedia with the poem, everything absorbed and wondered at in the faithless months, science, math, history, law, and all the rest you can bring with you and put to use when you return yet again to the one true faith. The one true faith. That is literature?
Yeah, well, there's a little tongue-in-cheek, Daniel. So there is no one true faith.
But you said it here.
Yeah. Sure. But it's a little tongue-in-cheek. But that notion that all... I suppose why I adore the novel as a form is that all those things can be its game. It can be about the whole, or the whole of human thought. There's nothing that it cannot be about. So therefore it's like the world, the entire world of thought, it's consciousness itself, wrought into some kind of shape, some kind of art form. But still it remains, I think, the form of investigation of our condition. It won't tell us really how to live. It might make us better at living, but it might not. It must have at its core pleasure. If there's no pleasure, forget it. I mean, do something else. And I love to quote Henry James. I often invoke his essay, The Art of Fiction. He says, the first duty of the novelist is to be interesting. And the most arid pursuit, and we discover this at school, when we're forced to read things, the most arid pursuit is to read a novel because you think it might be good for you. You've got to have some kind of spark of curiosity, interest, engagement. Without that, the novel is dead.
Well, I'm totally sure you're being read, and we read you because you're really, really interesting and it's exciting. The world of Ian McEwan and his novels is exciting. You once said, I like standing up in front of people in bookshops or theaters. It means less time alone with the ghosts. I hope you had a good time with us.
I did.
Although we addressed some pretty scary demons haunting modern society.
Those potatoes weren't so hot.
So hot. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, unser Gespräch ist am Ende angekommen. Ich danke Ihnen ganz herzlich fürs Kommen. Thank you so much, Ian McEwan.
Thank you, Daniel.